we have been to a couple of places a couple of times on the Renaissance Tour this year. We have not been to Waco, Texas, and that's where we're headed this Saturday. Oklahoma headed to Waco to face Baylor. Last time I was in Waco, it was not something to write home about. I had a blowout on I-35, but this time things are going to be better. I already got to hook up with one of you. One of you fine folks have come through, and so we are going to rectify the rental car nightmare situation. One of our friends at Enterprise has come through in Dallas, so we're not worried about that. And I'm having them triple check the tires before we ever head out of Dallas. But we're going to be in Waco Saturday. Find someone who loves you half as much as we love the big noon kickoff on Fox. I love it. I love it disproportionate to pretty much anything else in my life. And that's what time this game kicks off Saturday. 11 a.m. local time, noon Eastern. It's the first time we will have seen Oklahoma since they went into the bye week. And so what has the talk been around there? Well, I guarantee you it's probably had a lot to do with starting fast. You know, Texas, they struggle in the second half. Oklahoma's been struggling in first halves. The difference is they got the horsepower to rev the engine in the second half, and they can actually take a lead and come from behind and win against maybe some more inferior teams. Well, Baylor offensively poses about as balanced a threat as Oklahoma has seen so far this year. Baylor, meanwhile, you talk about the external on the Oklahoma side of things. Baylor, this qualifies them as being in wounded animal mode. They went to TCU last week. TCU threw everything, including the actual kitchen sink from Gary Patterson's house. They threw it all at Baylor. And they got a 30-28 win, I believe was the final. Baylor equals wounded animal mode. Oklahoma coming out of the bye. Do they stumble like Alabama did last week, or do they get shot out of the cannon? A couple of external factors. I don't really know how to quantify what that means, but just a couple of externals to keep an eye on. Here's problem number one for Baylor. Their secondary is vulnerable. We saw it last week against TCU, and we also know that for some of the flaws this Oklahoma team has, it's probably the best core of receivers and combined with quarterback that Baylor will have seen or will see all year. And that doesn't necessarily spell doom, but it does mean you got to execute at a really high level, a much higher level, especially in the back end, than you did last week against TCU, but also makes it imperative for Oklahoma to take advantage of that. And that goes back to what I talked about, the theme having to be around this program, the fast start. Got to have a fast start. Because if you got a vulnerable secondary, but your receivers aren't really torching them and you're not really making big explosive plays through the air, it doesn't really matter. That's just a vulnerability you didn't expose. Here's the big problem as I see it for Oklahoma. Outside of Oklahoma State, which is probably the best defense in the Big 12 right now, outside of the Cowboys, Baylor's moved the ball pretty consistently against every other defense they've played. And as much as we're talking about vulnerability on the back end for Baylor, you can fill in that same blank, but you can put the Oklahoma Sooners logo there. They're not, I won't say just as vulnerable, I won't say it's an apples to apples, but relatively speaking, that's where Oklahoma can be had too. It almost makes me lean towards an over here. The total's at 62, 62 and a half. There it is on the bottom of the screen. I don't do a whole lot of totals. I feel like I may move on this one, and if we move, obviously we want it before it gets to 64, a very key number in totals. Couple of good running backs for Baylor, couple of good wide receivers. It's going to be a really balanced attack. So both have to have an imperative fast start. But the other thing is, remember last week, I go back to this because I think it's really huge. Remember last week when we talked about Alabama coming out of the bye week, and we talked about how, hey, for better or for worse, this product Bama puts on the field, albeit against LSU, at the time we thought an inferior opponent, we're going to know a lot about what they're made of and what their consistency will be down the stretch based off what we see in this game. Well, Bama was bad the other night. Nick Saban himself said that team didn't look like Alabama in a lot of areas. Well, now Lincoln Riley gets his shot at Oklahoma. They know that they've underachieved relative to their standard, but they still got a 0 in the loss column. And so they get to go down here. They're not making them play at night. They get Baylor in the opportune time for Oklahoma. They get them really, really early in the day. And this starts a stretch that will define Oklahoma's season. It's probably the four toughest defensive tests that this offense will have faced all year and that Caleb Williams will have faced all year. They're going to Baylor, facing Dave Aranda and his defense. You're facing Dave Aranda and his defense. You've got to take on Iowa State next week, one of the best defensive programs in the Big 12. You've then got to go to Oklahoma State and face pound for pound what I think is the best defense in the Big 12. Then you're probably going to get one of them in the Big 12 title game. I have my doubts that Oklahoma can go 4-0 against that stretch. It's going to be tough to go 3-1 against that stretch. I'm just putting it out there. So they've got it to do. Let me just put it that way. Let's take a look at what the model thinks here. Oklahoma is a 5.5-point favorite at Caesars right now. And the model looks at this, and the model thinks still a little low. The model likes Oklahoma. It has Oklahoma -7. So I went back and forth a couple times on this. And I ended up going with the model here. And I think it's going to be a late situation. Don't think it's a pull away early situation. But I do think there's a little extra flex on the back end of this game for Oklahoma to where it's kind of a dogfight, but there are enough margins on the Sooner side of things to where they win it and then they end up covering, kind of like a 7 or a 10-point game, something like that. So I'm going to take Oklahoma to win. I'm going to take Oklahoma to cover, but it's not a game I'm going to put my money on because I don't have confidence in Oklahoma like that yet. And I also fully respect what Baylor will be capable of Saturday, again, being in the aforementioned wounded animal mode. Going to be a fun game to be at, though. McLean Stadium, first time we've ever been there. Looking forward to it.